My name is Chris Collier. I am the Executive Director of Renew Theaters, which manages the Ambler County, Princeton Garden, and Highway Theaters. And I want to thank you for joining us tonight for this virtual discussion of high society. We are thrilled, as always, to have Hannah Jack here to lead us through this discussion. And I am very happy to turn things over to her very shortly. But as always, I just want to do a quick intro, reminding everyone of the Zoom protocols and just touching on some upcoming events and items of note. The first is, if you have not had a chance to see High Society yet for some reason, or if in case this discussion inspires you to want to see it again, we do have an encore screening at the Ambler County and Garden Theaters on Thursday night. So if you only saw it on the small screen or again want to see it again, we do have it at the theaters this week. And I also just got confirmation that we also will have a theatrical screening of Witness for the Prosecution, which is our September film. So that will also be available on the big screen at the Ambler County and Garden Theaters. We will be posting the dates shortly. I did not get to put that up because we just got the confirmation on that. But the discussion is going to be on September 14th, and we will probably have the film playing just the weekend before. So you'll get a chance to see that classic back on the big screen. So this series is originally started at our theaters here in Pennsylvania, but actually just looking in the chat now, we actually have Richard joining us from California, who found this on Facebook, and I know some others are joining us from other states. I know Georgia is represented. So this is really exciting to see so many people joining us for this conversation and expanding our network outside of just our theaters in Philadelphia, New Jersey area. And that is also the hope for this program, that it is not just for these immediate theaters, but something that we can continue to grow. And as I mentioned last month, we actually got a further grant from the Vesta Fund, which started this program, allowing us to grow this program further. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll be announcing more. But this fall, in addition to this classic Hollywood series, we are also going to have additional speakers who will lead us through conversations on Middle Eastern cinema, Asian American identity, and we've got a really fantastic lineup of Wes Anderson titles, Wes on Wednesdays, which will have Wednesdays leading up to the release of his new film, The French Dispatch, with some incredible Wes Anderson film scholars from across the US. So please keep an eye on our websites, and for information, we will be adding a lot more content soon. But this conversation around classic films has really developed such an incredible audience, and it's so great to see so many regular faces each week. Thank you for coming back and joining us. Just quickly, Zoom protocols. We ask that everyone please remain on mute, especially in the beginning while Hannah is doing her little talk, setting the scene for us. And then if you do have a question, please use the raise hand feature. That actually will jump you to the top of my screen so I can see you. If you are raising your hand, I am toggling through and trying to see everyone's screen, but using the raise hand feature is the best way to see everyone. And I will call on you there. And then as we get later in the conversation and things are a little more free flowing, we can just open it up and jump in and talk freely like we're all sitting in a circle together. Let's see, any other notes? No, really excited to have you all here and to have Hannah back to guide us through. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Hannah is a writer for Turner Classic Movies who has scripted many of the introductions to movies that air on the network and that are delivered by the hosts. You may have heard many of her introductions on Turner Classic Movies, but also on HBO Max, Filmstruck, and in classic movies that have screened on the big screen as part of the TCM Fathom Events Big Screen Classic Series. We are thrilled to have her leading us in these classic films, but even happier to have her right here in Bucks County and as a member of the County Theater. So with that, I'm happy to turn things over to Hannah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. Thank you all for being here. It's so great to see many people returning month after month, and also some people joining us for the first time. So welcome, and I hope you enjoyed High Society. I do want to say, as Chris just mentioned, that next month, like he said, is our talk is going to be about Witness for the Prosecution, which is a lesser known movie, but definitely one of my absolute favorites. And I can't recommend it enough. If you can get into the movies to see it on the big screen, it will be such a treat. If you don't know anything about the movie, it is directed and adapted by Billy Wilder. A couple months back, we talked about Billy Wilder in the context of Sunset Boulevard. He also is the director of Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, so many great movies, Double Indemnity. But this is a real kind of change of pace for Billy Wilder. It is a British set courtroom drama adapted from a story by Agatha Christie. So you know that the story is going to be phenomenal. The movie stars Charles Laughton, one of the great English actors. His wife in real life, Elsa Lanchester, is in it. Tyrone Power, Marlena Dietrich. And it's a movie that will keep you on the edge of your seat from start to finish, and had such a surprise twist ending that the movie was advertised when it premiered, telling audiences up front, if you know the ending, don't tell anyone else. So I'm not going to tell you anything more about it other than go see it if you can. And next month, I'm very excited to talk about it. That'll be on September 14th, the 1957 movie Witness for the Prosecution. So moving on to tonight's movie, just from 1 year before that, 1956, High Society. I am going to go see it in the theater this week, but how many people did get to see it on the big screen? Just show of hands. Oh, great. Okay, wonderful. And I'm curious to know with this one, how many of you, if you could just show your hands, saw this movie coming to tonight for the very first time, had never seen High Society before? Great. And because it's relevant, and I'm going to mention it, I would love to know how many of you do know the movie that it's based on, The Philadelphia Story from 1940? Okay, wonderful, because that is relevant to talk about, and I will be talking about it a bit. So it's great as a point of reference. If you don't know that movie, don't worry about it. I'll give you some context, but if you do, it'll be a useful point of reference. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to share some images as I'm talking. And you should now see a picture of Bing Crosby and all the gang. Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, so High Society, as I said, it is a remake. It's a musical remake of the 1940 classic, The Philadelphia Story. So The Philadelphia Story was also produced at MGM, same as High Society. The same studio decided to remake the movie 16 years later. In the original version, which you see there on the left, it was directed by George Cukor, who's one of the great directors of the golden age of Hollywood movies. And the cast was Katharine Hepburn as Tracy Lord, Cary Grant as C.K. Dexter Haven, which is the role Bing Crosby took over, and Jimmy Stewart as Macaulay Connor, the role that Frank Sinatra plays in the remake. It began, though, not as a film. It began as a Broadway play 1 year earlier. And it was written for Katharine Hepburn as a vehicle for her by the playwright named Philip Barry. And it came at a very important moment in Katharine Hepburn's career. Just prior to that, she had had a series of box office flops. And so the Independent Theater Owners of America labeled her unfairly box office poison. She wasn't alone on that list. They published a very public list of major stars, you've heard of all of them, who were all labeled box office poison because their movies were not doing well. And most of them bounced back with some sort of comeback movie. And for Katharine Hepburn, it was The Philadelphia Story. She loved the material, and she originated the role of Tracy Lord on Broadway. And toured with the production, and it was a huge, huge, huge hit for her. And if you look on the right there, if you can see, that's a shot from the original stage production. And if the classic movie fans in the group will probably recognize a couple faces there. That's Joseph Cotten on the left playing C.K. Dexter Haven, and Van Heflin on the right in the role of Macaulay Connor. And it was such a huge Broadway success that Katharine Hepburn was able to negotiate to take ownership of the rights herself and sell it and make her return to the big screen triumphantly and reprise the role on screen in the MGM film adaptation. And she had tremendous control over that production. And it was a huge hit and earned her an Oscar nomination. It totally erased her status as box office poison. And it earned a number of nominations, including it won Jimmy Stewart the Oscar for Best Actor of 1940. So this was a very, very successful film. And if you know it, we can certainly talk about comparing it. But 16 years later, fast forward, and another producer at MGM named Sol Siegel, he wanted to remake it as a musical. And that's how High Society came about. It was Sol Siegel's idea to turn to this material and infuse it with a musical score. And it was his idea. He's the one you see there on the left with Bing Crosby and Grace Kelly. It was his idea to relocate the story from Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia story, to another, in atmosphere full of socialites that would fit very similarly, but Newport, because 2 years earlier, the Newport Jazz Festival had just been established in 1954. It's still going. And it was a new thing at the time. And Sol Siegel decided that by moving it to Newport, you could suddenly have this excuse for all the musical numbers and an excuse for the presence of Louis Armstrong and his band. That's actually why I chose High Society this month, because for those of you who watch Turner Classic Movies, this month, August, every year on TCM is a month called Summer Under the Stars, where every day the network dedicates 24 hours of programming to a different Hollywood star. And so you see each star has just back-to-back movies, and every year there are some who have never gotten that kind of day-long tribute before. Louis Armstrong this year was one of them. So if you caught his day on TCM last week, you probably saw High Society was on the program. And he serves a really interesting function in this movie that nobody served in the Philadelphia story. That kind of character just simply didn't exist. So his character was new, and he's kind of a Greek chorus in this movie with his band. And as you see on the poster, he really did perform at the Newport Jazz Festival multiple times. And then MGM commissioned an original score written by Cole Porter, who's there on the right. So this score for High Society was written for the film. And it's some terrific, terrific music. And Cole Porter was no stranger to writing both for Broadway and for movies at the time. This was made, though, at the end of what we consider the golden age of movie musicals. When you think about the big, splashy, lavish Technicolor movie musicals that MGM was the studio that produced them, we're talking about movies that came out from the mid-1940s through the mid-1950s. This was the heyday of the movie musical. And we're talking about movies that starred some of the greatest movie musical talent of all time: Judy Garland, Gene Kelly, Fred Astaire, Howard Keel, and all of these people who you see in these films. Meet Me in St. Louis, An American in Paris, which won the Oscar for Best Picture, which is a very rare thing for a musical to do. Singing in the Rain, The Bandwagon. These were movies that were produced when the audience's tastes for them were at their height in the years during World War II and immediately after. And then tastes started to change, and leadership at MGM started to change too in the early 1950s. So High Society is coming out when the movie musicals are really starting to go out of favor. What replaced them in the late 1950s and definitely into the 60s were movies that were not written for Hollywood. They were written for Broadway and imported. So what follows in the 1960s are movie musicals like The Sound of Music, My Fair Lady, West Side Story, these all started on Broadway as stage hits, and then Hollywood adapted them. But what we're talking about here are movies that were musicals that were written for the big screen. And these are all originals, and High Society is one of them as well. But despite the fact that this genre was kind of at its end, at the time, it still brings together a real powerhouse of some of the best talent in the musical film business at the time. So some of those people are the director, Charles Walters. Chuck Walters is what he went by. And he was one of MGM's top musical directors. When we think about the top musical directors of these movie musicals, we often think about people like Vincent Minnelli or Stanley Donen and Gene Kelly. Chuck Walters was right up there with all of them. He started out as a stage performer. He was on Broadway, and he had a dance background. So when he came to Hollywood, he not only directed the movie musicals, he also choreographed them. And some of the movies he had made before High Society were movies like Good News, Easter Parade, The Barclays of Broadway, Summer Stock. I mean, some of these terrific movie musicals that he not only directed, but also choreographed. So you see him on the left there with Grace Kelly, on the right with Judy Garland. He had been nominated for directing the musical Lily. So he was a mainstay at MGM as a musical director. And he did also stage the dance, I mean, the musical numbers in this film too, in addition to directing High Society. And then you have the cast. And these four people who were leading the cast here all had a lot of really impressive credits under their belt by the time they made this movie. So you have Bing Crosby, who had for 2 decades up to this point been one of the biggest singing stars in the world, and a crossover star in the movies too. He, in 1944, won the Oscar for Going My Way. He also had a couple other nominations to his name at that point. Then you have Frank Sinatra, who more recently than Bing Crosby, but still just as significantly was one of the biggest singing stars at this point as well, and had also won an Oscar for From Here to Eternity, a very dramatic role for him. And another nomination he'd just come off of when he made High Society for playing a heroin addict in The Man with the Golden Arm. And then on the bottom there, you have Grace Kelly in her Oscar-winning role. It was one of the first performances she gave, which was The Country Girl. And there she is co-starring with Bing Crosby. So High Society was their second movie together. They also, side note, they did have an affair during that earlier film. So they, in real life, had a little romance that had preceded High Society. And then you have Celeste Holm, who in one of her earliest roles won an Oscar also for, that's the movie Gentleman's Agreement from 1947. And it had 2 more nominations, including All About Eve, which you may remember her as Betty Davis's good friend in that movie too. So all of this to say that these people had done all this work before they made High Society. They were all big, big names and big stars. And it was a huge deal specifically to have these 2 guys together on screen. Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby, it is impossible to overstate what superstars they were at this point in their career, and how much audiences just lined up around the block to see them on screen together for the very first time. It had never happened before. They had a scripted friendly rivalry on the radio, and everyone kind of assumed they were rivals and they hated each other, and it was going to be, they were going to come to blows. Whatever. They loved seeing them play rivals in a movie. It was totally incorrect. They loved working together. They got along great. In fact, they teamed up again a couple years later when Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack produced the movie Robin and the Seven Hoods. He cast Bing Crosby again. They liked working together. That was the second of 2 movies they made together. And Frank Sinatra openly admitted that he idolized Bing Crosby in his youth. There was an age difference between them, that he grew up really looking up to Bing Crosby as a singing star. So the question became, what number would they sing together? And this was because this was going to be the number in the movie that everyone wanted to see. And so how this number, Well Did You Ever, came about, I mean, if you think about it, it has no business being in the movie. There's no point in the plot. There's no reason for these two men to be in this library drinking together. It's not doing anything. But audiences had to see Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby sing together. So what happened was one of the musical directors looked back through books of Cole Porter music to try to find a number that would fit. And he came across the number, Well, Did You Ever? That is the only number in the whole movie that was not written for this movie. It was in a previous show called Du Barry Was a Lady, which was a Broadway show. And ironically enough, the people who performed that number in the original Broadway show were Betty Grable and Chuck Walters, the director of High Society when he was a Broadway star. So this kind of came full circle for him. And he staged the number for these two guys to sing. The other huge deal factor of High Society that we have to mention is the fact that this was Grace Kelly's last movie. And it was known at the time that it was going to be her last movie, because fittingly, she's in a movie about, playing a woman who's on the precipice of getting married. And that was true in real life. She, just a few months before High Society premiered, she married Prince Rainier and became Princess Grace of Monaco. And that was just, it timed out exactly the same. And she knew that this was going to be the last movie before she retired from Hollywood. And she asked Chuck Walters if she could wear her actual engagement ring in the film. And he said, well, what does it look like? And she came to the set wearing the biggest diamond anyone had ever seen. And he said, okay. And so that's the ring that you see right there, that she was wearing her real engagement ring in the movie. And I did say last month, we were talking about Rear Window, if you were with us last month. And Grace Kelly inadvertently, this was not planned, but we have a back-to-back Grace Kelly double feature that we've landed on. So I said last month that I would talk a little bit more about her Hollywood career and her early life too. So she, for all of us Philadelphia natives, she was a Philadelphia native. And honestly, the Philadelphia story could have been about her. She was born in a very wealthy society family. And she started performing on stage when she was just 10 years old and got her start performing in Philadelphia region, including the Bucks County Playhouse, which is a local theater for many of us. That's a on the stage of the Bucks County Playhouse. She gradually got more recognition and made her Broadway debut in 1949. And that caught the attention of Hollywood, and she went to Hollywood in the early 1950s. After one kind of brief appearance in a film, she went on to give her second performance, co-starring with Gary Cooper in the 1952 landmark Western High Noon. That was just her second movie role. And that movie didn't really show much of her talent, but it was director John Ford who saw something in her and decided to cast her as the third, I guess, corner of a love triangle with Clark Gable and Ava Gardner in the romantic adventure Mogambo in 1953. He thought that she could, show a little bit more, he could bring out a little bit more in her. And he was right, because even before that film premiered, Alfred Hitchcock watched it and thought, oh, there you go, let's cast her in Dial M for Murder. And thus began her 3 pictures with Hitchcock in a row: Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and To Catch a Thief. And in the meantime, she's also, giving an Oscar-winning performance in The Country Girl. And this is all happening in just a few short years in the mid-1950s. And then that's it. She left Hollywood in 1956. So she had kind of an indelible movie career, but very, very brief, before she decided to just step back and not step back, but step away and become a princess. And that was the sum total of her Hollywood career, more or less. But it was a huge, you can imagine, people were eager to see her on the screen in her last role and eager to see Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra together. So I'll just close by saying that High Society was an enormous box office hit when it premiered in 1956. And not as big of an Oscar contender as the Philadelphia Story, but it did earn 2 nominations for the song True Love and for its score. it lost to the song Que Sera Sera, sung by Doris Day in another Hitchcock movie. And the score award went to The King and I, which was another bigger musical contender the same year. So I'm going to stop my presentation here, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about the movie. I don't know if there were some questions that came in while we were talking. I'm just going to close this out. Okay. Check out here. Just listen to You Must Remember This podcast, so that Howard Hughes bought the rights to the Philadelphia story and gifted it to Hepburn. Yes, he did. Howard Hughes, you know, there was a lot to say about his relationship with Katharine Hepburn, but he did buy the movie rights as a present for her and gave them to her, and she was able to negotiate a deal with Louis B. Mayer at MGM to get the director she wanted and the cast she wanted. Actually, the first people she wanted for Dexter Haven, she wanted Clark Gable. And for Macaulay Connor, she wanted Spencer Tracy, and they had never worked together before. So that could have been an interesting cast too, but they weren't available. So it went to Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart.
Yes, Richard.
Okay, I'm kind of here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I'm kind of here as a naysayer. I put a little thing on Facebook after the movie was on Turner Classic Movies last week, and posted how much I don't like the movie High Society. And I
Tell me why.
Well, I'll try to remember all of them, but one of them, the worst one, are the phony sets. The movie just looks cheap somehow. The sets are not filled out. They didn't go on location, except I think they did some exteriors at the Vanderbilt Mansion in North Carolina. But you never see them wandering around Newport. Remember that all these houses, all these fancy houses in Newport are built on cliffs over the ocean. You didn't see one set in that movie hardly with an exterior window, let alone anything to look at over the ocean. So it just seemed like a real cheap, they made the movie as cheaply as possible. And the sets, I think, are a betrayal of that.
It's a great point. I never really thought about it. Remember how expensive the stars were at the time too. So a lot of the budget went to them. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, of course, it's a studio made musical, and it's a fair point.
And remember that this is the same musical that a couple years earlier made Brigadoon, and decided to shoot that on sound stages rather than spend the money to go to Scotland to make it on location.
Yes, absolutely.
Also, the same studio made Seven Brides for Seven Brothers on a sound stage in a studio. Hardly any of that was shot in exteriors at all. And that would have looked beautiful filmed on locations. And it was one of their biggest money makers from '54.
You're absolutely right. You're bringing up some great points about the process of producing these musicals at MGM. And very, very often these musicals were made within the controlled environment of the studio and the sound stages, because it was easier to achieve the artistic look. It was very much an artificial artistic look that was being created. But there are a lot of logistical components too about making a musical on location versus making, let's say a drama on location. There are a lot of other components that needed to be very, finely controlled. So that was definitely something that is a very fair criticism of the MGM musical of this era in general. I
see some other hands up, so we can come back to you if you have other thoughts, Richard. But Joe, your hand was up first.
Richard stole my line. I love Frank Sinatra. I am a huge Sinatra fanatic, and I've seen High Society, I don't know, a dozen times over the years. I've been able to see it on the big screen many times. It's boring. It's slow. Bing Crosby is way too old for Grace Kelly. And over the years, this film has become, for me, a movie with some of the most memorable music interludes in any movie. Well Did You Ever is could be the best pairing that the two of them did ever in their career. And they sang a lot together on television. But, you know, once they're not singing, it just doesn't. It really, really doesn't work. I'll take it one step further, and I'll probably get thrown off this call for saying this, but I'm not a big fan of the Philadelphia Story either. So that could be another debate. But this thing is just slow. It didn't work. It didn't get good reviews. It made a lot of money, and it has grown. It has grown in legend over the years. But you know, Frank got it. Frank took the role because he wanted to sing with Bing. And a little footnote: while they were making this movie, Sinatra, who had a weekly TV show at that time, wanted to direct, and he talked Bing into joining him in a half-hour show called Happy Holidays with Bing and Frank that ran, I don't know, the following year on ABC, only shown once. And I was very fortunate. Years ago, I was working with the Sinatra family, and they came to me. We were putting out DVDs. Frank had passed, and we were putting out some DVDs. And the Sinatra family came to me, and they said, Nancy was cleaning out a shed, true story, cleaning out a shed. And there was a pile of cans, film cans, that she was going to throw away. And a gentleman by the name of Charles Pignon, who runs the estate, you know, had thought, no, don't throw these away. Let me look at them. 35 millimeter. And he put them on, and one of them was a decayed, turned red print of this show, the only one in existence. Half-hour show. First time Frank ever directed anything. So they redigitized it, you know, fixed up the color, and we were very fortunate to release it on DVD. You can now find it as part of a box set that I think Shout Factory put out. But it's a half-hour special of Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby singing the most wonderful Christmas carols of all time. Try to seek it out. But the idea hatched while they were making, you know, one of the worst Frank Sinatra movies ever. Sorry.
No, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so exciting. I'm definitely going to check that out.
Yeah. So, and Louis Armstrong almost steals the show.
I was going to ask everybody who you thought of all of these personalities steals the show, but I see so many hands going up. This is
so many hands.
So much to say.
Remy,
yeah.
And just a reminder before we get Remy, I did not say, but I put in the chat is open. So if you have thoughts that you want to share, please, there's an ongoing conversation in the chat while we're getting to everyone. It's great to have that sidebar. So please keep entering your comments in the chat. All right, Remy, on to you.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, it made me think, you know, the cast is sort of unbalanced or balanced with half like amazing musician superstars with Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, and Louis Armstrong. And then you have the women who are not singers at all. Was there any consideration for hiring women who could sing or men who couldn't sing? And was there any, you know, it was a musical, so it's sort of strange that the women are not that strong in that department.
It's such a good point. I often think about that when I watch this movie, that it is a very male-centric story, despite being about this woman. It certainly 100% was crafted from the start as a vehicle for Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra. It was meant to be for these singing men. In the same way that the Philadelphia Story was crafted as a vehicle for Katharine Hepburn. And if you watch them back to back, you'll definitely see the weight of the story shift from one focus to a different one. I will say though, weirdly enough, Celeste Holm started out, got noticed for being a musical theater star. She was Ado Annie in the original production of Oklahoma on Broadway. So definitely had, I mean, you know, not the greatest voice in the business, but had the musical theater experience and was, that's how she started her career, and that's what brought her to Hollywood. So had a musical theater background. It gets a little bit of a, I don't, you know, in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and that's kind of the extent of her singing in this movie. And Grace Kelly too, there's a little moment of harmony in True Love, but that's all she gets. and it's the men who get those musical numbers.
Tom?
Yeah, good evening. So, I always wonder when I've watched this movie, unlike I think Joseph, who earlier was saying he wasn't a fan of the Philadelphia Story. I'm a huge fan of the Philadelphia Story, and I always wonder, am I watching this because to me, it does not hold up to the Philadelphia Story, and I'm just not. I'm still not sure about that, but I agree that outside of the music, which I think is terrific, and the addition of Louis Armstrong, which is such a great addition. They're just, other than that, the movie doesn't really work. I especially that the Philadelphia Story did very well in developing the chemistry between Macaulay Connor and Tracy Lord. That scene in the library where she's reading his book and she says, "Wow, you've got a lot more going on here. You're not just this reporter." And that was substituted by them driving, Frank Sinatra and Grace Kelly driving around in her car, and they're saying, "Oh, look at all these poor multimillionaires who are losing these vast mansions, as if they have to sell these mansions and now they're on the streets of New York." I don't think so. It was, so I never got that same. And then they go to Uncle Willie's and they look in each other's eyes and they, and I didn't buy that chemistry there the way I did in the Philadelphia Story. And so but incredibly good music, a great addition of Louis Armstrong. Really wonderful to see him in this. And I'm going to throw out, a shout out to Louis Calhern as Uncle Willie. This IMDb fact, not that I knew this, this was also his last film. He died right after this. And I was trying to remember, okay, I know this actor from so much. And of course, it was Ambassador Trentino from
Duck Soup.
and one of the great movies of all time. So I just had to show a shout out to Louis Calhern.
Yes, thank you for shouting out Louis Calhern. He plays Uncle Willie, and he was about to work on another film after this and died suddenly during that production. He had a very long career that dated back to the silent era, and he was a handsome leading man. He was considered a very dashing, suave man in his youth, and fell into playing character roles as he got older, in many movies. I'm sure you've seen him in a lot of things. And yes, to your point about the chemistry also, I'd love to hear what other people have to say about, especially if you know the Philadelphia Story, comparing them. It would be a great double feature to kind of look at them back to back. But the chemistry, certainly the Philadelphia Story is a straight play. It's a non-musical, and in a lot of musical remakes, which we can also talk about, that process, a lot of the storytelling and the kind of emotional movement of the plot gets handled by the musical numbers. And the musical numbers were absolutely the focus of this movie. The scenes, the scripted scenes, absolutely took a back seat to highlighting those musical numbers. So I think that's a totally fair criticism. And I agree that the nuance of the characters, the subtlety in the character development, the Philadelphia Story has it all. And it's much more, if it's in high society, I think it's baked into those musical numbers a little bit more. That's just my opinion. But yeah, other thoughts?
Anne, your hand was up.
Yeah, I am a big fan of MGM musicals, but this one doesn't do it for me. And I've seen it numerous times. This was the first time I saw it on the big screen. However, I much prefer Philadelphia Story. I've probably seen that more times, but seeing it on the big screen, I noticed some just little subtle things I hadn't noticed seeing it on the TV before. And one of them was, in each scene, the female characters were all in sort of monochromatic outfits. Like, I don't know if this was planned or not, but like Tracy and her mom were both in just like tan from head to toe in the first scene. They were in blue head to toe in the next scene when they were getting ready for lunch. And then even the wedding, her mom had a pink dress and her dress was like a very pale pink dress. And I don't know if that was on purpose or there was it's minor, but I never picked up on it before watching it. The other thing is there's another musical number in the film we haven't talked about, which is the jazz number. I think it's called That's Jazz.
Now You Has Jazz, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that really to me saved the movie, because just seeing Bing and Louis Armstrong singing together, knowing they had a lifelong friendship, and it was really great watching them play off of one another.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the highlights of the movie too. And you get to see Louis' whole band, and they really get a moment. I will say this about Louis Armstrong in the movies. He, more often than not, was playing a version of himself in the movies. That he had a long film career that went back to the 1930s and started out, sadly, with a lot of very racially stereotyped appearances in his earlier films, playing the trumpet, but playing versions of a trumpet player that have not withstood the test of time. But he evolved as he became a much more recognizable figure. He went on to play himself in a lot of movies, and like he does here, and was often the one who elevated the production, because he just brought so much charisma and so much undeniable talent, and often was the one who was teaching the square characters how to enjoy jazz and appreciate it. And so I think that number too is kind of the pinnacle of the epitome of that. And this is certainly one of the roles that he was given in movies that showcased him to the greatest advantage. There are a couple of others, but this is one of them.
Yeah, on that note, Hello, Dolly.
Yes.
And then he had a big radio hit from singing that as well. There's one other thing I noticed, which was the dialogue. Since I've seen both movies so many times, the dialogue is almost identical in many scenes.
It is, yeah.
They didn't seem to change it a whole lot.
Yeah, so. In many scenes it is. In some scenes, as Tom pointed out also, there are some scenes that have been totally reworked, although involving the same characters. So yeah.
Lisa, thank you for your patience. You're up next.
Okay, so I have to say that I'm a huge fan of Bing Crosby, but I can appreciate the comment made before that it was sort of implausible that he should be the boyfriend or the former husband of Grace Kelly. But I think it was equally as implausible to think that Katharine Hepburn would ever divorce Cary Grant. And that always got me. So, yeah.
Very fair, yeah. And remember though, that like I said, Grace Kelly and Bing Crosby did have a thing off screen. It happened, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Holly?
Yeah, I'll jump on the pile and saying I didn't really enjoy this movie very much. It was my first time seeing it, and like many people, I'd seen the original many, many times. So I spent some time thinking about why it wasn't working so well for me. And a lot of it did come down to charisma, and sort of the kind of staginess of the original is fine because it's part of this, screwball sort of genre, and it comes from a play, and the charisma of the actors is so good that you really get to the heart of the characters in a way I didn't feel in this one. There were a lot of strange, like the mother I thought was way too old to have that young daughter. Also the young daughter is a much kind of funnier character and more played up in the original. I also thought that the high society and the setting in color and so forth, with like more naturalistic acting, having come into Hollywood, was kind of had a tough thing to do. It just seemed very out of step, sort of somehow. And yet you had like the color and the close-ups, and so it's in some ways more naturalistic than the jazz and the setting with the Newport Jazz Festival, and yet it seems very, very, that sort of played up the staginess in a bad way to me.
Yes, it's a great point. I think that you're exactly right, that the what it's trying to do feels out of step with the time. If you remember what I was saying before about the other major movie musical that kind of dominated in 1956 was The King and I, which is a totally different kind of picture. It's enormous in its scale, in its scope, in its production values, in its realism of its performances. It takes a much different tone and a much different approach to the movie musical, and kind of indicates where Hollywood was going with this. The kind of last hurrah of the big lavish MGM musical was Gigi, which was came shortly on the heels of High Society. And that was also a different thing. That was a big over the top production. And High Society is much more pared down. As we were saying before, it feels a lot lower budget in certain ways. And its musical numbers are much more intimate. It's not such a grand scale picture. So it definitely was, I mean, as somebody said before, it was not a hit with the critics. It was a hit in terms of its pop stars who were involved. And it was definitely, indicative of this kind of genre that was on its way out and morphing into something very different at the time. Yeah.
Following up on Anne's question and what Polly had mentioned, there was a question in the chat from Russell saying, I don't feel that the movie showed much attention to the Newport Jazz Festival. Had the production originally been meant to spotlight it more than the movie did? Do you know anything about that, Hannah?
It was not meant to, as far as I know, it was not meant to really involve other performers or other acts. It was meant as an excuse for these jazz singers to have their musical numbers. It's a great question.
Brian?
Yeah, I mean, the movie's pale imitator of Philadelphia Story. But a couple things that do make it worthwhile watching are the two songs that were mentioned. And I just found Grace Kelly absolutely delightful in this film. Whether she's playing, play acting as the stereotypical heiress speaking French, and she played a great drunk. She played tipsy better than almost anyone. And it's very much a production of its time. And my wife actually pointed this out to me after we had done watching it. The two male characters don't need to change in the end. It's the female who has to change to get the happy ending. And that seems to be a very 50-ish thing.
Yeah, it's such a great point. It's also, it is the plot structure of the 1941 too, but I love that point about Grace Kelly, and I wanted to know what you thought, since we have seen these two movies. We saw her in one of her best Hitchcock movies, and then this, and so they're two very different genres. What you think of her, as an actress, and which one kind of, because there were comments about her chemistry with Jimmy Stewart last time too. If you were with us for Rear Window, which performance you like better? What you think in terms of her acting chops? If there were any thoughts about that?
Well, I would
Richard?
prefer in Rear Window, just because I think that's a better film, and she does give a great performance in that. But in this one, she showed comedic timing that I didn't know she had. I wish she would have done more comedies. It was very light and breezy, and I really missed her when she wasn't on screen in this.
Great point. Hard shoes to fill, to go into a role that Katharine Hepburn originated, with many of the same lines, as someone was pointing out. Yeah.
Richard, I see your hand up.
Yes, I think Grace Kelly was fine in this movie. She, who at the time would have been, better for it? Perhaps Lauren Bacall, but Grace Kelly was really good in it, and I thought. One character we haven't mentioned at all, who is an actor that you wonder how he got any parts, and that's a man named John Lund.
Yeah.
He played the fiance that was dumped when she married Bing at the end of the movie. But that guy just, he's so bland, so white bread in any movie he's ever been in. He just brings out yawns. He was anybody remember a movie To Each His Own with Olivia de Havilland, where she dances with her son at the end of the movie, and it's John Lund. And to think she waited at the end of the movie, all that movie, just for John Lund. Anyway, we should maybe discuss him too.
Yeah, fair point.
Joe?
Grace Kelly, I mean, she's beautiful. She's absolutely stunning, not just in this movie, but I guess, you know, every movie but The Country Girl. And that's the one that, you know, she takes home the award for, but she's absolutely gorgeous. And she speaks well and she looks good. And yeah, she's good in just about everything. And she liked older men. It's pretty obvious. She married one and she had an affair with one named Bing Crosby. So, you know, that was Grace. You know, while I were making this movie, and I just read this, it's not something that I knew, but they had nicknames for Frank and Bing. And I'm going to read this so I don't get it. And I read this in a lot of reviews. They called Frank Mr. Dexedrine, and they called Bing Mr. Nubital. And that's the difference in the way that they were. You know, I mean, let's face it, Bing was more of he might not have been a good father, but he was an older guy. When Frank, especially during this time, was getting into the swinging Capitol years, and he was going to make, I guess, Pal Joey came after this, Hannah, or yeah, Pal Joey came after this. Two completely different personalities that you know, that again worked very, very well in the film. But
yeah, Frank Sinatra also a very varied movie musical career. If you think about Frank Sinatra in the 40s in movies like On the Town and Anchors Away and Take Me Out to the Ball Game, this young, bright-eyed, innocent, skinny, you know, nervous around women image that MGM promoted him as, next to, you know, tough, athletic Gene Kelly who could always get the girl. That was the Frank Sinatra that audiences knew in the 40s. And he totally had to reinvent himself when his career kind of began to falter in the early 1950s. And with From Here to Eternity playing this totally different character in a wartime drama, showed that he had a lot more maturity. And that began kind of a different Frank Sinatra chapter, and that continued to evolve. So he's also at an interesting point in his career when he makes this. But I don't want to forget to ask everybody, because I'm so excited that you have very varied opinions about High Society. If we were to do a different musical, because this is really the first musical that we are talking about in this series so far, what movie musicals would you be interested in learning more about? And you can stick them in the chat so that we have a record of it, or just share out loud. What other movie musicals would you love to talk more about?
Anyone, just feel free to unmute, jump in.
I'm seeing some come in the chat too, so great.
You know, it's weird, it's different, because the point that you made about Gigi is so important. And by the way, Hannah, you're fantastic. I just want to make sure that that's said. So you're so interesting. But the point that you made with Gigi, everything changed, because the musicals were, you know, the MGM stuff were one way. I mean, they're all made on sets. And, you know, West Side Story really changed things, shook things up. And musicals were never the same. They tried and they failed. Hello, Dolly bankrupted 20th Century Fox. They tried to do the old style, you know, musical, and didn't work. So for me, anything from West Side Story forward is great, and anything before that, I find to be problematic for my taste. So that's just
Great
kind
point.
of like
Thank you.
me putting
From the chat, I will just note that An American in Paris has taken the lead with 3 votes. There are a lot of ties.
Great.
Lots of Meet Me in St. Louis, The Bandwagon, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. Oh, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers has 3 votes.
Keep it
Tied
tally,
with
Chris.
American
Thank you.
Paris. Yeah.
Cool. Great.
What's your favorite musical?
Oh, my favorite musical? It really varies. have a deep and unabashed fondness for The Sound of Music. I think it's a perfect movie. But I think it's a different animal from a lot of other things. And I love all of the ones that you're listing. And all of these that you're listing also have fantastically interesting production histories. So I'm noting all of them for the future. This is great. And a question, also about remakes. I'm curious to know if we have fans of remakes, if there are anyone who thinks that there has been a remake that surpassed the original, because we've been talking a lot about this one paling by comparison to the Philadelphia Story. Is there any instance where you can think of a remake that's even better, in your opinion?
I think one of the best remakes I ever saw, and I really liked the original too, was The Parent Trap. The remake was done with Lindsay Lohan, and she was so good. I like the second movie maybe a little better than the first one, because they give kind of a little more in depth to the servants, who in this movie were really, really funny. So I recommend, if you haven't seen the second Parent Trap, please do.
I love it. That's such a great example, and I'm with you. Yeah.
Anne, your hand is up.
Yeah, I'd have to say A Star Is Born, the one made in the 50s. That version, that's really awesome. Just the way Judy Garland sings "The Man That Got Away," it's just, that you choke up listening to that every time,
And you bring it full circle, because she lost the Oscar to Grace Kelly for The Country Girl.
Right.
And that's one of the biggest points of contention for fans of the Oscars in classic movie history, feeling that Judy Garland should have won.
And bringing it back to other films that you just mentioned, Hannah, there are two mentions of Man Who Knew Too Much.
Yeah.
I'd have to vote for The Maltese Falcon. It was the third filming of that story. I've never seen or even heard of the first two, but that's the perfect of that genre. So I guess those others are out there somewhere, but
Absolutely. Yeah. And you bring up such a great point too, which is that a lot of times when movies are announced that there's going to be a remake nowadays, there's a lot of outcry about how could you do that, the original, and I'm certainly one to make that comment sometimes, but this is nothing new in Hollywood. Hollywood's been remaking its own material since the beginning. So definitely.
You mentioned Mogambo.
Yeah, Mogambo was a remake of the movie Red Dust, which is also a great movie too.
Yep, and John just shared that His Girl Friday, another title that we recently talked about. So.
Great.
It's interesting.
Richard,
directors remaking their own films, and Affair to Remember.
Doesn't happen very often, but does happen sometimes, and it's interesting when that does. Yeah.
Richard, I saw your hand up again.
Yeah, well, one thing, Affair to Remember is continuing on what you're saying, Joseph, is a continuation or the same story as Love Affair. Both were written and directed by Leo McCarey. And if you see some scenes in there side by side, it looks like they're just kind of talking casually, but it's really, the same dialogue. He didn't change any dialogue in some scenes. It was already there. They did it again, and it was really well done. But another thing I was thinking of that was very good, it's not exactly a remake, but it's pretty close. A Perfect Murder with Michael Douglas and Gwyneth Paltrow. It's a rich guy trying to kill his wife. And it's got a lot of antecedents in Dial M for Murder, in the hiding of the key. But it has other elements, I think, which make it a little more interesting than Dial M for Murder. But with Michael Douglas and Gwyneth Paltrow, A Perfect Murder.
Richard, you mentioned Affair to Remember. I think the climax, I'm taking for granted everybody has seen these films. I don't want to give away the ending, but that last scene where he goes and visits her, I believe is word for word from Love Affair.
Yeah, so much of those movies, those two films, they're both excellent. I recommend seeing Love Affair with Irene Dunne and Charles Boyer, and An Affair to Remember with Cary Grant and Deborah Kerr, made by the same director. and they are almost shot for shot the same movie, one in black and white and one in color, made a couple decades apart. But these are all excellent examples of remakes, and an excellent reminder that this is something that's been happening a lot. Something that happened also a lot when MGM was deciding to musicalize movies. This was nothing new to take something that had not been a musical. And it's something that's happening now on Broadway a lot, where Broadway is turning to movies to turn them into musicals. So this is also, again, things come back all the time where Broadway is deciding to mount productions of, you know, this is a couple years now, but like The Producers or Young Frankenstein, or movies that were great, or musicals that did not begin as musicals. They began as movies and were turned into musicals for the stage. I see that we're coming up on the hour, so I just want to see if anyone had any other questions or thoughts while we wrap up. These are such great examples in the chat too.
Yes, I often feel that sometimes the films that are not beloved by everyone produce some of the best conversations.
Yes,
So
yes.
really
same.
enjoyed the conversation tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We have a shout out to the 1949 Little Women in there. I love that. That's great.
How many times can they remake that movie?
Still counting. Same with The Star is Born.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I really hope you'll get a chance to see Witness for the Prosecution, either streaming it or seeing it on the big screen. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts about that one. Any other last questions or thoughts? Great.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
We will see you back on September 14th for our next conversation.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you.